Welcome to Madison Street. You're in a National Historic Preservation District here. This is where Susan B. Anthony lived with her family from 1866 until 1906. And we're going to go into 17 Madison Street. It's a National Historic Landmark. You may know that there are maybe 80 to 90,000 properties on the National Registry of Historic Places, but only the top 3% have qualified to become National Historic Landmarks. That has to be a place where something happened that really changed history, that was an influence in our country or maybe in the world. And 17 Madison Street is one of those places. Of the 2,300 National Historic Landmarks, only about 3% deal directly with women's history. So this is one of the places that's unique. Well, come on inside. As one of our visitors once remarked, she said, "This house looks like the house I grew up in, but Susan B. Anthony was famous. I thought all famous people were rich." Well, clearly, Susan B. Anthony and all her impact comes from an entirely different context. Come meet the person and meet the space that was so important as her home. We're in the front parlor of Susan B. Anthony's house, 17 Madison Street. For some people, this is what the journey is all about, because this is the room in which in 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting. Let me set the stage a little bit for you. Following the Civil War, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and others from the American Equal Rights Association believed that one way to create the democracy that had been envisioned originally back at the time of the Declaration of Independence and the time of the Revolutionary War was to assure that every human being who was a citizen of this country would participate in the election of the leaders, because after all, the governed get their authority from those who they're governing. The moment after the Civil War for Susan B. Anthony was critical. It was a time to really say this country had been founded on ideals that we'd never lived up to. And she and Frederick Douglass and others felt that this was the chance to truly show the rest of the world what a democracy of the people, by the people, for all the people could be like. Well, following the Civil War, there were some Reconstruction amendments, and one of them was the 14th Amendment. That's the one that you hear about the most, because it's the one that says everyone gets a due process of law. It's the one that says if you're born within the boundaries of this country, you're automatically a citizen. This was a radical concept. One, it meant anybody who had been brought into the country, even those who'd been kidnapped from the shores of Africa, who had had children, all of those children were now citizens of this country, the United States of America. For women of any color, suddenly this new radical idea, I was born here, I am a citizen. Even in the 19th century in the United States and New York, women didn't have some of the rights that we take for granted now. A woman in New York State, when Susan B. Anthony was born, could not enter into a contract if she was married. She couldn't rent a space. If she had children, they actually were not the children, though she had given birth to them. They were her husband's children. And that old custom where Jane Doe becomes Mrs. Fred Smith, actually legally, Jane Doe becomes Mrs. Fred Smith, and Jane Doe legally ceased to exist. She couldn't assert any rights on her own in 19th century America. Now that was true for white women of any class. Imagine how much of a barrier it was for women who spoke a different language or who had a different skin color, who had no rights that they could assert before the law, no rights to property, no rights to keep the wages that they might earn through their own activities, no rights to be the mothers of their children. That 14th Amendment provided the assertion that you were a human being and you were a citizen. So although they've been working for voting rights all across the country, and new states that were coming in out west were becoming states, sometimes coming in with territories where women already could vote, it was understood that until there was a constitutional amendment, there'd be no way to prevent states from continuing to put up barriers that kept citizens from getting to the ballot box. So using the 14th Amendment, the women all around the country, now Susan B. Anthony is the most famous one, but there were women all around the country who were going to electioneers or going to the registrars and saying, I'm a citizen of this country now based on the 14th Amendment, and I have a right to vote, and I'm going to vote in the next federal election. Well, here in Rochester, 15 women registered. 3 days ahead of time, they talked the registrars into it, and they gathered here on the morning of Election Day And they walked out down West Main Street and down to a place, and some stories say it was a barber shop and some say it was a shoe store, but we know right where the location was. There's a monument there. And they cast their ballot. And Susan B. Anthony came home and wrote to her friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton, "There, gone and done it, voted today." Now other women around the country were denied. Sojourner Truth tried to register in Battle Creek, Michigan, but never made it to the ballot box. But the word was out. The women were testing this new constitutional amendment. For some, they would say they already had the right to vote now based on that 14th Amendment. Others would say, well, women just can't be allowed to participate in government. It's too messy, it's too dangerous, and they don't know how to think through the appropriate kinds of issues that are important to governing. For Susan B. Anthony, did she vote illegally or did she vote legally that day? They knew they were testing the United States Constitution, so they waited. 2 weeks later, up on the front door of this house, knock, 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 comes the United States Marshal. "Susan B. Anthony, I have a warrant for your arrest." Now, Susan understood the value of the press, and she said, "Oh, right, arrest me." The U.S. Marshal said, "Miss Anthony, you could just report downtown. We know where you are." She said, "I want to be treated as you'd treat any male prisoner." He actually declined to do that, but off they went, and they got on the trolley, which would have been a one-horse trolley out on what's now West Main Street, and they headed downtown. I think Susan probably would have liked to spend the night in jail, but her lawyer couldn't bear the thought of Susan B. Anthony spending a night in jail, and much to her dismay, he posted bail for her. When she got out to that trolley, and they asked for her fee, she said, "I'm in the custody of the United States government. He will pay my fare." So word was out. The press around the country, around the world, knew that Susan B. Anthony had been arrested for voting in Rochester, New York, and now they waited for the trial. This is the room in which that arrest took place. And so when people come here from miles away, sometimes thousands of miles away, for some people this is the place to think about that challenge that really is not a challenge about the U.S. Constitution, but a challenge about who is a human being? What is humanity for us? What does it mean to have a democracy that's supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people? And that's why Susan B. Anthony stood here and why those women marched with her that morning in 1872. Here we are in the back parlor of the Susan B. Anthony house. We think of this more like the family room. This is the place where tremendous conversations would happen and people would be really concentrating on how to move human rights forward in the country. We have an image of Frederick Douglass on the mantle here. Susan B. Anthony actually carried a daguerreotype of Frederick Douglass with her on many of her travels. People talk about their relationship. We know that they frequently were working together. We also know that they had a split, and that was over the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Together, they had formed the American Equal Rights Association, along with other notable folks like Harriet Tubman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, William Lloyd Garrison, and sent a memorial to the United States Congress that they wanted to make sure that the two groups, the two largest groups, who did not yet have a voice in our democracy, would get it. And specifically, they talked about black men and women. Woman being inclusive of all people for Susan B. Anthony. Douglass was close to Susan B. Anthony's father, who was one of the earlier supporters of his newspaper. When they met out on the family farm, there'd be other folks gathered there together because Sunday afternoons at the Anthony farm was all about learning how to fight slavery and end the institution, about awakening the people of the North who somehow had gotten comfortable with the idea that that was a problem in other states. Susan B. Anthony became one of the first people to be appointed by the New York State Abolition Society to travel, and she went to every single county in New York to bring up people's concerns about how to end the institution of slavery. Douglass and Anthony called that an agitation. Organize people, educate them, and then agitate them so that it wasn't just an idea, but was something that they would believe in passionately. It was one of her earliest causes, and in fact, when she was working to awaken people to the horrors of enslaving other human beings, is when she faced the most difficult times in terms of having tomatoes thrown at her, being thrown out of town. Sometimes when she would go to speak, the idea of this woman, a single woman, speaking to a crowd of what they called a promiscuous assembly, men with women, would be run out of town. They would heckle to try to silence her voice. They would throw peppercorns into the stove, creating what in the 19th century was tear gas, as the peppercorns caused the air to burn people's eyes and send them running from the room. Here we imagine the minds and the hearts of people like Anthony and Douglas as they passionately committed themselves to changing the world for the better. This house was actually built in 1859, and when Susan B. Anthony's mother bought it in 1866, it was only 2 stories. A little Italianate house in a working class neighborhood. In fact, the neighborhood is a wonderful example today. The Cunningham Carriage Factory over on Canal Street, 2 blocks over, was the biggest business in Rochester in 1900. And as these houses were developed in the little park that's just up the corner from us, it was intentional to have the big Italianate houses and the small 600 square foot bungalows right next to each other, and to have a park that served as everyone's backyard. If you can imagine, then, that's the neighborhood that Susan B. Anthony and Mary and their mother Lucy and others lived in the 1860s. By the time we get to the 1890s, the National American Woman Suffrage Association is a national movement with chapters in the states and territories all around the country. And they're still trying to push for a change in the Constitution. Susan B. Anthony and others knew if they didn't change the Constitution, they were never going to get women's voting rights in the South, because there were those who were concerned that if you empowered black women in the South, you might have people outvoting people who had formerly been their enslavers. So what did they do? They raised the roof and they added this 3rd floor to the house. They added the fireplaces we saw downstairs, and this is where the work happened. I can feel the energy here, and we like to think that every inch of this space was dedicated to human rights. But it was also a family space. Susan B. Anthony's nieces would have practiced their violin up here. Behind us, we had stenographers. Susan B. Anthony had 3 full-time stenographers. She was dictating to them, and letters were going out by the bushel from this place. They were going out to all around the country, and today you can find those letters with the 17 Madison Street address on them. This is the space where Susan B. Anthony and her biographer, Ida Husted Harper, sat down on this corner and wrote her biography, where they used the stack of scrapbooks that Mary had put together to remember about the movement, because Susan knew that no one was writing women's history if women didn't write it themselves. And so she worked to make sure she had a biography. And this is also the space where the history of women's suffrage was written. The first 4 volumes incorporating all of the movement from the early 19th century, and then even past Susan B. Anthony's death, there were 2 more volumes. So this space was history in the making, and they were making history here. Sometimes people say, is the house haunted? Well, that has to do with your own beliefs. But what we know is that there's an energy in this place. And when a group of Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts come upstairs and sit down on the floor and hear the story, they get imbued with that energy. And that's when we want to remind them. Susan B. Anthony said, when I'm gone, carry on with the work. So if we understand the essence of her work to be about working for human rights, then we take little spaces like this in our homes and in our communities, and we make those places where we educate and organize and agitate for the change we still want to see. This desk that we have on the 3rd floor was pretty significant. We talked earlier about Susan B. Anthony and being very excited about those Reconstruction amendments. Well, she wasn't very excited about the 15th Amendment. In fact, she and Frederick Douglass had a split. The American Equal Rights Association, you remember, was formed to say we need to get the voting rights for black men and for women. And we believe Susan B. Anthony understood that to be all women, but we know that some people would limit that by race or by national origin. The 15th Amendment was the first time that we actually put male into the United States Constitution. For many, they saw an opportunity right after the Civil War to make sure that black men could have the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment says no male person may be denied the right to vote on the basis of prior servitude, assuring that people who had been enslaved could be citizens of this country and vote. But it was introducing male. Susan B. Anthony was disappointed. That would be an understatement. She really felt if we were going to redeem the country and be of the people, by the people, for the people, it had to be for all the people, and didn't want the movement to split. She and Frederick Douglass had a famous debate, and Douglass raises the very important issue of having voting rights for black men is a matter of very survival at this point in the country's history. So we ask visitors to think about, where would you have stood? With Frederick Douglass, who would say we should get what we can get now. We must get what we can get now. We have to get what we can get now. Or Susan B. Anthony, who would say we must stay together and get the rights for all. Well, the American Equal Rights Association splits and the 15th Amendment passes. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the others right away form the Women's Suffrage Association. And Susan and Elizabeth decide to launch a newspaper, and they call it the Revolution. And the Revolution is important. The title refers us back to the Declaration of Independence, to the idea of no taxation without representation. If women can own property, if people of color can own property, how can you tax them and use their tax dollars without letting them have a vote? Isn't it just essential that that revolution that was so important hadn't been achieved yet, even 100 years after the country had been founded? Well, in the paper of the Revolution, you can read all about the debates that were happening. It's where Susan B. Anthony makes it very clear to us she was opposed to the 15th Amendment, not because it would give black men the right to vote, but because it wouldn't give black women and all women the right to vote. Not because it would give a right that everyone should have, but because it didn't give it to enough people. So she and Frederick Douglass disagreed on the strategy. And as we know, it didn't take long before the states in the South found ways to prevent black men from accessing the ballot box, using things other than race, like literacy tests or property ownership or income barriers, or today, photo IDs or birth certificates or registration, or putting the ballot box so far away, or making the line so long that you can't access your right to vote. Because in the United States, the states still set the laws about who votes and when they vote, unless the United States Constitution guarantees a right. Well, it was another 60 years before we had the passage of the 19th Amendment, which said that no woman could be denied the right to vote on the basis of sex. But still, we can deny women the right to vote based on many other means. The Revolution was published for 2 years. Susan eventually went bankrupt with that and had a debt of $10,000 that she eventually paid off to others. But you can still read the Revolution out online, and you can read about many of the issues that were important and significant in their time. And this desk that we have here on the 3rd floor was at Susan B. Anthony's office in New York City, where they published the Revolution magazine. And then it went off to Kansas with her brothers, and then it came home here to us. It's another place where the intersection of the personal and the agitator come together in one space. Imagine the sounds of people typing here. It's interesting to us when kids come up a few years ago and they would say, "What are these things?" "Oh, these are typewriters." And we would say they're like the keyboards of today, but now kids swipe. So one of the things about being in the place is it brings things to life. Typewriters were an important asset. Susan B. Anthony understood if you wanted to change people's hearts and people's minds, you had to reach them where they were. That's why she was an organizer. So she would send copies of the History of Women's Suffrage out, and she would say, take them to your quilting bees, or take them to your little gatherings, as they would call them, make it sound not too intimidating. And imagine a group of women gathered around a quilt that they're creating for someone's sister or for a family, and someone's reading from the History of Women's Suffrage, these powerful speeches that talk about this revolution, this idea of a world of the people, by the people, for the people. And then the women would start to discuss those issues, and they would decide, well, let's get organized. Let's work for women's rights. Maybe they were a group of women who were seamstresses, who were getting the opportunity to turn their home into a factory and getting paid by piecework. And they started to think about the injustices and the dangers. Well, if we could organize, but if you don't have a vote, you can't put pressure on the politicians. Susan B. Anthony understood that. You need a voice and you need a vote to be able to implement the change that's so important for all. So this space, if you can imagine, Susan B. Anthony and her family became postmasters in the towns where they lived, because then they got free postage and they could send letters all around the world. Here in Rochester, where the telegraph was developed and implemented, the telegraphs were the way that Susan B. Anthony and the movement would communicate across this country. Susan B. Anthony was traveling the country before they drove that spike that joined the railroads from the east to the west. But here, in this home, they were organizing and gathering and thinking about a movement and how to change the rest of the country and, in fact, even the world. Right here we have the sign that was put up in 1945. This actually was Susan B. Anthony's mother's home, Lucy. Lucy sold it to Mary, which gave her an annuity. The Susan B. Anthony house was actually never owned by Susan B. Anthony. And if you were here in Rochester, you would want to learn more about Mary, because Mary was just as much a champion for human rights, just as strong a character. And so when the women in 1945 bought this house to create a memorial so we would remember these pioneers, they made sure it was in the names of both of those women. We're in Susan B. Anthony's office at the top of the stairs on the second floor. And when you come into this pretty small space, imagine this, by the 1890s, is the headquarters of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Mail goes out, sometimes 2 bushels a day. Susan B. Anthony's keeping 3 stenographers, full-time stenographers, busy taking dictation and typing up letters. They're sending out petitions, they're sending out organization pamphlets. They're trying to organize, agitate, and educate all around the country, because it's still been a few decades and women don't have the right to vote. There's so much energy here in the house. And the fascinating thing is, by 1900, Susan B. Anthony and Queen Victoria are the 2 best known women around the world. Now, Susan was willing to become the person who was known as the icon or the agitator. She was willing to take the press. In fact, you remember, she started her own magazine, The Revolution, because she felt that the press needed to have accurate and informed opinions about what was going on in the movement. She was very frustrated that they couldn't get the American press to back the women's rights movement the way they'd gotten the American press to get on board with the abolition of slavery. So she started their own press society. And Susan B. Anthony was one of the first people to say, get press. Get good press if you can, but keep them talking. So she had the press bureau happening, and she branded herself. She wore a red shawl wherever she went, and she carried an alligator purse where she went. Those 2 things became so popular that by the 1870s, 20 years before this is the headquarters, Susan B. Anthony out in California is being referenced in a jump rope rhyme that ends with, "Vote," said the lady with the alligator purse. There were times when she showed up not wearing her red shawl, and the press said, "Can you change? Because it just doesn't make as good a story." But Susan B. Anthony would be the first person to tell us that the movement was not about her or about individuals. It was about changing the hearts and the minds of the whole country to lay the right groundwork to become a true democracy. There's a picture that we have of her sitting here at her desk, and her desk is pretty full, and she's got pictures of all these women, and she's staring at them. Well, it's because a magazine had come to take a picture of the very famous Susan B. Anthony, leader of the women's rights movement, and she wanted the picture to capture that it was a movement of so many women all across the country. In the 1890s, imagine television shows, we can look at things like 1883, and we can look at the Gilded Age. Susan B. Anthony's taking trains from downtown Manhattan across the country out to where there's wilderness. Sometimes she's in a buckboard, sometimes she's riding astride a mule, sometimes she's in a sleigh, sometimes she's on a train, traveling sometimes 8,000 miles a year. All not because it was about Susan B. Anthony, but because it was about a movement to change hearts and minds, to do that agitation and that education and that awakening. And that's why Susan B. Anthony gets recognized as one of the most significant leaders in the women's rights movement. But she would always have said, "It's not about me, it's about all of us." She repeatedly would write a letter that would say to people, "Do the one thing that you have the time or the energy to do, and it will make all the difference for our cause." People would apologetically say, "I can never be Susan B. Anthony." And she would say, "You don't have to be Susan B. Anthony. In fact, you shouldn't be Susan B. Anthony. You should do the one thing that you can do, the thing that you have time or energy for, and that's your role in a movement that started from a little place, like a little room like this second floor space that was Susan B. Anthony's office." And we loved in her office, she had things like a sampler that she created when she was 11 years old. She's an international figure, but in this space where she is generating the energy, we have the personal, and it connects us with the reality of that human being, an 11-year-old who's learning how to sew. We don't think of Susan B. Anthony as being good in the domestic arts, but she was. In fact, she'd come home from travels and she'd spend 2 weeks mending the 2 dresses she'd taken out on the road for months on end. One of the things that we have up here is that alligator bag that we mentioned, where the jump rope rhyme says, "Vote," says the lady with the alligator purse. Now, this wasn't a fashion statement. It's what they call a club bag. She would have had her speeches and maybe the daguerreotype of Frederick Douglass in there, and books that were important and helped her. But people knew that she was the lady with the alligator purse. And her message was that we need to be connected and engaged with voting. And this place, this little room in this house on Madison Street in the middle of this city neighborhood, was where all of the work was being done, where people were going out by this time, by the 1900s, not just for women's rights in the United States, but for women's rights around the world. Susan is known not just for the change that she caused to happen here, but the change that she still is pushing for around the world. Here we are in Mary's bedroom, Mary S. Anthony, Susan's younger sister, and this actually was Mary's bedroom set. Now, if you lived in Rochester in the 19th century, you would know Mary Anthony's name. Both Susan and Mary were big advocates for pay equity, having been teachers in their teenage years when they were paid a quarter for every dollar that a man made in the same kind of teaching position, and where as soon as you married, you had to give up your teaching position because it was so inappropriate for a working woman to earn a wage on her own in those early days. There's a story out in one of our historical markers that says that Mary was the first female principal in the Rochester City School District. That's actually not correct, because Mary was offered the job to become a principal, and she said she would be glad to accept that job if they would pay her what the last person made. And the committee was embarrassed because the last person was a man, and there was no way they were going to pay Mary as much as they paid him. So she actually didn't take the opportunity to be the first female principal. She declined. But they came back a couple years later, and she required that they pay her the full wage. So she was the first woman to advocate for equal pay for equal work in the city school district and get it. That gives you a sense of Mary and all the Anthonys. They were all working to make sure that the change happened that they believed in. It was Mary who bought the house from her mother, and the Susan B. Anthony house was always owned by somebody other than Susan B. Anthony. Every year, Mary would pay her taxes, which you were obligated to do, and she would protest and write a protest on it. This is taxation without representation. And Mary's protest, because she also was a speaker and an organizer, and she organized the Women's Equality Club, and she helped work with groups of women to get safe milk stations in town. She worked to help provide opportunities for women who had been brought from other countries, immigrant women who'd been lured by promises of fair pay and equal jobs, but who actually were being trafficked and brought into this country to find equal housing and opportunity and to help them learn the English language so that they could survive. Mary was the champion, and this would be the Mary Anthony house if she didn't have a pretty famous sister. Susan said she couldn't have done any of the work that she did had it not been for Mary's support, because Mary took care of the home fires and earned wages and sometimes made the house a boarding house so that she could support the work. Susan's mother was a tremendous support of her cause, as was her father as well. We have a letter from Mary's nurse. Mary died about a year after Susan did, and the nurse said that it came to her to take Mary's tax payment that year when Mary was dying from lymphoma. And she says there were tears in the tax collector's eyes when he realized Mary wasn't going to be able to make her protest herself. The newspapers had published it every year when Mary said taxation without representation. So remember, the revolution wasn't finished yet. Now, it's a strange place to have a bedroom right in the middle of the house. Down that hall is the bathroom, but there wasn't a bathroom when they moved in 1866. So at night, there would have been chamber pots under your bed that would have to go out to the outhouse at night. When they added the bathroom, then Mary's room was kind of between people and the bathroom then. But I like to think of Mary being so much the center of this house and this space, being the energy and the person, a hidden figure that we don't know enough about, but who, in her own right, the more we learn about her, the more she was changing history too. We're in Susan B. Anthony's bedroom. This is the back of the house on the second floor. And when she was home, this was where she was. She would make comments in the early years that this was kind of a cold space, but we're above the kitchen. So when they were cooking downstairs, it would be warmer. And it was warmer after they eventually got steam heat coming into the house. This is Susan B. Anthony's bedroom set, and the whole world was turning its eyes to the papers, waiting to hear about Susan B. Anthony. She had gone to Baltimore to give a speech. It was her birthday, and she was 86 years old, still having great posture. At 5'6", she was tall for her generation and for her time, and she had a real presence that you could sense when she walked into the room. And by this time, people would recognize Susan B. Anthony because her image had been out in the press for years and years. 86 years old, and they still didn't have the women's right to vote. She'd been advocating for more than 50 years. But she had seen other progress. She'd seen advances in terms of women's rights. She'd seen advances in terms of education. Susan really understood that we needed a public education system that could provide opportunity for everybody, regardless of race or class. And she had pushed for that as well. And another change she'd seen was in professional nursing. Following the Civil War, there was an opportunity for women to help with taking care of the wounded on both sides of the war. And in fact, they were appointed to go out and give care. But at that point in time, the women, like Dorothea Dix, who was appointed to be head of the Army Corps of Nurses, couldn't supervise men because that was considered inappropriate. So she couldn't supervise all the male nurses who'd been commissioned. But around the country, the feminists from the 19th century saw this opportunity as a chance to demonstrate that women had organizational ability and administrative ability, that they had an executive function. And Susan B. Anthony believed in the profession of nursing that was progressing from home care, which she had done for her own family for years, to educated nurses. And she went in 1902 to the convention here in Rochester. She was invited to be the keynote speaker. 82 years old. She takes a little break from her traveling across the country for women's rights and voting rights. And she gives her speeches saying that the profession of nursing needs to have standardized training and registration, believing that if nurses were registered in New York State, they would gain status and people would understand that this was a profession for which you had to be trained and which you would be completely competent. And following Susan B. Anthony's work in 1902, they passed the Armstrong Act, and New York State became one of the first states to register nurses who had been trained in this profession. Well, by the time we're here, 1906, Susan goes to Baltimore for that convention, and she knew she had fluid in a lung, so there's no antibiotics, and she's 86, so chances are she may not survive at this point in time. And she wanted to keep going as long as she could, rather than to have a long, slow death. She gets up in front of a crowd, and the place is packed with more than 1,000 people. And when she's introduced, they get up and give what we call the Chautauqua salute, waving hankies and kerchiefs in silence for 10 minutes, giving this icon of the movement a standing ovation. And Anna Howard Shaw, who was one of the women in the movement, acknowledged in her own writing that as much as Susan B. Anthony had done this work for years, where she'd been thrown out of places and had her life threatened and been burned in effigy, it had never been about Susan, but she said it surely must do the old heart good to see this support and these accolades. Well, Susan gave a speech, and she's outlived some of the greatest pioneers for the human rights movement: Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So many others have gone before her. And still, women don't have the right to vote in this country, but they're seeing some momentum. And she summarizes, and the way the story goes, she says that though she will not live long enough to see it, she knew that she maybe only had weeks left. Failure is impossible with the cause in the hands of those such as these. So she's passing the baton to the people gathered there, sending them the responsibility to take on the work. And she finishes her speech, which was short for her. She's not well. They put her on the train and send her home to Rochester and cancel all the engagements she's supposed to do next. She's so sick they can't even get her upstairs here to her bed for 3 days. And she gets up here, and the 2 nurses are registered nurses who are taking care of her, and she says, "My nurses are without exception." Her physician is Marcina Riker, who is a woman who is a physician who could not have even gotten an education before the work that Susan and others did earlier in that century. Riker is acting as the intermediary for the press, and everyone wants to know what's happening with Susan B. Anthony. The world is waiting to hear. And she's delirious, and she gets a little bit better and worse, and she's talking to the few who are gathered around here, and she's saying, continue on with the work. And on March 13th, 1906, Susan B. Anthony breathed her last. And the world's newspapers are filled with comments and eulogies. One of the ones I like the best is one from a reporter who says, well, that idea that she has about giving women the right to vote, that's never going to come to pass. That's not going to happen. But Susan, this reporter says, changed the world more for women in her lifetime than had ever happened before or since. We have right here Susan B. Anthony's silk dress. She had helped the territory of Utah, where there were Mormons, get the right to vote. And she had taken a lot of heat for that one because some people did not support the Latter-day Saints and their beliefs. And Susan believes that all people are equal and said that any religion is as true as it is in alignment with the powers of the Creator. Because Susan helped the Mormon women get the right to vote, out in Utah, they had learned to make silk themselves because they had been persecuted when they left Palmyra, New York, and headed to Independence, Missouri. Along the way, they had found it hard to buy goods. Sometimes they couldn't open bank accounts. They had found it hard to acquire property, and so they decided they needed to be independent. And silk is a very important fabric in the rituals that are important to the Latter-day Saints. So Mormon silk is an incredible item, and they imported mulberry trees and silkworms and made silk from scratch, some of the most beautiful, strongest silk. And so to honor Susan for her 80th birthday, the women of Utah had sent her 5 yards of this gorgeous fabric. And she hadn't made it into a dress, and she was so proud to wear it because of what it represented, that there was progress being made. Even in some of her darkest, most challenging times, and Susan spent a whole lifetime working to make change, and she saw things move forward and things move backward as well. She lived in a century where you saw some of the worst human treatment of other human beings. And once when a reporter asked her, how do you take the defeats where another state votes to give women the right to vote or has an election, but it doesn't pass? And she said, defeats? There have been none. We are always progressing. And the way that we understand our mission here at the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House is to provide hope, because we can always progress, and to provide a little education and some agitation so we keep the work going. In this small room just off the back parlor, we're in Mary's study. Now this room has all kinds of stories related to it. Right now you see it set up much as it was often when Mary was using it as her office. She had a desk, she had a daybed, she had a sewing machine in the space. Behind me you see a wonderful image of Rhoda DeGarmo, who was a next door neighbor and ran the Underground Railroad site next to the Susan B. Anthony farm out by the airport. We have Clara Barton over Mary's desk. Clara Barton, many people know about the American Red Cross. They may not realize that Rochester was the second chapter of the Red Cross, and we're told that the papers were written here because Clara and Mary were good friends. Now, sometimes it wasn't Mary's office. Susan and Mary had two sisters who died of tuberculosis, her sister Hannah and her sister Guelma. And when Guelma was dying of tuberculosis, she came here with her whole family, and this was her room, her sick room. They added a doorway so there would be more fresh air. It was easier to get her outdoors to the outhouses and to take care of her here close to the kitchen. So Susan and Mary and the family cared for Guelma in her last days, and also for her sister Hannah, who lived next door, which in the house that's now our visitor center. And Hannah, when she got tuberculosis, came here and was nursed by her sisters. So in this little room right here off the back parlor, we had movements happening for Mary, organizing the Political Equality Club, thinking about how she was going to get Rochester to move ahead in its issues of justice, and also working for the national movement and supporting her sister Mary. We're told that even just before she died, Susan bought a phone for her sister Mary, and Mary was using the phone, calling women all across the country to organize and educate and agitate. When the Anthony Museum was started as a memorial in 1945, the 19th Amendment was only 25 years old, but the Rochester women were worried that people were going to forget about the work of these important pioneers like Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells Barnett and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mary Church Terrell. And so they wanted to establish a memorial to remember. What amazes me is, though we've recently celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, when this place was established as a memorial, there were still people who knew Susan B. Anthony, who stayed in this house, who lived here, who were telling the stories in first person, remembering the significance of the place and the events of their lifetime. I'm standing next to this sewing machine because it's one of those stories. There was a woman named Anna Dan who first came here to the Anthony house and worked as a housekeeper. She then got training and became a stenographer and worked like a secretary for Susan B. Anthony and was very close to the family. She eventually got engaged, and the wedding was actually held right here in the house. The only man was her husband, and Susan B. Anthony and Mary were the witnesses to the wedding. Anna Howard Shaw presided. At that point, the Anthony sisters presented Anna Dan, now Anna Dan Mason, with this Singer sewing machine as a wedding gift. And Anna Dan Mason was alive in 1945, and when she heard that the house had been acquired and was going to be created as a memorial, she wrote and said she was sending the sewing machine to come home to where it had started from. This space connects us with history, but through actual people with real stories and real memories about what they did, what they tried to do, and what they hope for the future. This is a room that we call the guest room. It actually was Lucy, Susan B. Anthony's mother's room, for many, many years. And we've got Lucy over here, and you can imagine Lucy was as supportive of the social justice issues that her family were engaged with as anyone else, always supporting Susan in her work and sending her off on the way. This large room, at sometimes when Mary was renting out rooms to boarders to balance the household budget, this might become the family parlor for a while other spaces were being occupied by other people. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was alive in 1945, she had founded the League of Women Voters after the 19th Amendment passed. And so when people were establishing this memorial, reached out to Carrie Chapman Catt, and she wrote and said that the suffragists always thought there should be a memorial and it should be in Rochester. And so that was part of the birth of this place. Carrie Chapman Catt, in 1945, sent a whole bunch of pictures and objects and suggested ways that this room might be set up as a museum. And for a long time, those pictures were on the walls exactly the way Carrie Chapman Catt told us to preserve them. We still have all those photos that you can see. But the room we've re-envisioned because during the time that Susan B. Anthony was alive, people would come here to the house, names that you might not know, but you certainly should know, because there were women in the 19th century who were changing the world. Names like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, as well as Anna Howard Shaw and Ida Eustace Harper, who we've already mentioned. So we put some of our Madison mavens up here on the wall as a reminder that not only was this house a place where Susan B. Anthony and Mary slept, it was a place where other people came. Ida B. Wells Barnett came when she was coming to Rochester to tell people, to introduce the Red Record and to tell people about the horrific cases of lynching that were happening in the 1890s across America, to agitate and expose and get people upset about what was happening in the Jim Crow South, to get people outraged and engaged in trying to respond to the horrific lynchings. And when she came here and spoke at Corinthian Hall, Susan B. Anthony said, "Please come and stay at my house." And several times when she was in Rochester, then she stayed here. We actually don't know which room she stayed in, but we do know that this was one of the guest rooms that would have been a part of that. And so when you come here, you are a part of those women and men who've journeyed miles and in their day made a very difficult journey to get here to Rochester, to be connected with the movement and the space. And so we want you to come be a part of this guest room. Thank you for coming for your tour of the Susan B. Anthony House. We hope you enjoyed it. You know, every time you come, a docent will give you a tour and explain it and tell you the stories that are most important to them, where Susan B. Anthony has inspired them. We're very excited to share the place because there's nothing like understanding the story and putting it in the context of history. We hope you'll come and join us here at 17 Madison Street.